The shocking encounter. It was a quiet night in James's small apartment. The glow of the street lights outside seeped through the blinds, casting faint patterns on the walls. James, a 24-year-old software developer, was sound asleep, wrapped in his favorite blanket. His room was a cluttered mess, papers, books, and empty coffee mugs scattered everywhere. He lived alone, and nothing unusual ever happened in his life. At least, not until that night. A strange humming sound filled the air, soft at first, but growing louder. James stirred in his sleep, his brows furrowing. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't the usual noise of his old fridge or the heater kicking in. It was otherworldly. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the room. James woke up with a jolt, shielding his eyes from the brightness. He sat up, blinking rapidly, trying to figure out what was happening. His heart pounded as he noticed something impossible. A shimmering portal glowing in the middle of his room. The edges of the portal rippled like liquid, and inside it, swirling patterns of blue and silver danced hypnotically. Before James could even think of moving, someone stepped out of the portal. His jaw dropped. Standing before him was a woman, though clearly not a human one. She was tall and elegant, her skin a soft shade of iridescent silver, glowing faintly in the dim room. Her large, almond-shaped eyes sparkled like distant stars, and her long, flowing hair seemed to defy gravity, floating gently around her shoulders. She wore a strange, form-fitting outfit that shimmered with colors he couldn't describe, and strange symbols glowed faintly on her arms and neck. James froze, his blanket slipping off him. It wasn't until he felt the cool air on his skin that he realized he was only in his boxers. His face turned red with embarrassment, but he couldn't bring himself to move or speak. The woman looked just as shocked as he felt. Her gaze darted around the room before settling on James. She spoke in a language he didn't understand, a series of melodic tones and clicks that sounded almost musical. I don't understand you," James stammered, finally finding his voice. He raised his hands, palms up, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The woman didn't seem to comprehend his words. Her eyes narrowed as she reached for a small, glowing device on her belt. It looked like a mix between a tablet and a futuristic weapon. She pressed something on it, and the device emitted a soft hum. James panicked. Wait. Don't do anything crazy," he shouted, waving his hands. "I'm not dangerous, I promise." The woman tilted her head, studying him. It seemed she was just as unsure of him as he was of her. She lowered the device slightly but didn't put it away. Her gaze flickered to the room around her, taking in the strange human artifacts, posters, books, and the cluttered desk. She looked confused, almost lost. James noticed her expression and realized she might not be here by choice. Are you in trouble?" he asked slowly, pointing to her, then to the portal. "Did you come here by accident?" She didn't respond, but her body language shifted. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and the glow on her skin dimmed, as if she were tired or distressed. James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. Despite the absurdity of the situation, he felt a strange urge to help her. Okay, let's figure this out," he said, more to himself than to her. He pointed to himself. "I'm James. James." She watched him carefully, then pointed to herself. Her melodic voice formed a single word that sounded like Zyra. James guessed it was her name. "Zyra," he repeated. She nodded. Progress, he thought. Before he could say anything else, the portal behind her began to flicker. The swirling patterns grew erratic, and the light dimmed. Zyra turned quickly, a look of panic on her face. She spoke rapidly in her language, gesturing toward the portal. James didn't understand, but it was clear something was wrong. As the portal flickered, a strange noise echoed from within, a low, menacing growl that sent shivers down James's spine. He instinctively backed away. Zyra, however, stood her ground, gripping her device tightly. She pressed a button, and the device emitted a beam of light toward the portal, stabilizing it momentarily. "What the hell is that?" James muttered, his voice shaking. He had no idea what was on the other side of that portal, but it didn't sound friendly. Zara turned to him, her expression urgent. She pointed to the portal, then to herself, and then back to the device. James guessed she was trying to say she needed to fix it, but before she could do anything, the growling grew louder, and the portal started to shrink. "Zara, if you're gonna do something, do it now," James yelled. The portal flickered one last time before disappearing entirely, leaving the room in silence. Zara lowered her device, her shoulders sagging in defeat. Whatever had been on the other side was gone, for now. But the tension in the room was palpable. James stared at her, his mind racing. "What just happened?" he asked, though he doubted she could answer. Zara didn't respond. She simply looked at him, her star-like eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. James realized his quiet, uneventful life had just been turned upside down, and he had no idea what was coming next. Misunderstanding and danger. Zara stood in the center of James's small bedroom, her glowing skin dimming as she clutched the strange device in her hand. The air still crackled faintly where the portal had vanished, leaving behind a faint smell of ozone. James's heart raced. His thoughts jumbled together. Was she dangerous? Could he trust her? But one thing was clear. Zara was just as scared as he was. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. She looked at the bed, the glowing computer monitor, and even the pile of laundry on the floor, her expression a mixture of confusion and curiosity. James could see she wasn't used to this environment. "Okay, Zara, right?" James said, pointing to her. "You're Zara. I'm James." She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. Her grip on the glowing device tightened. James raised his hands again in a gesture of peace. "I don't mean you any harm. Look, I don't even know why you're here." Suddenly, Zara's device emitted a sharp beep, and a holographic display flickered to life above it. Strange symbols, like alien hieroglyphs, floated in the air. James leaned forward slightly, squinting at the projection, but he couldn't make sense of it. Zara's eyes widened as she stared at the symbols. Her free hand moved quickly, tapping the floating glyphs as if she were trying to adjust something. "Is that a scanner or something?" James asked, mostly to himself. Zara didn't answer, too focused on the hologram. Then, without warning, the hologram flashed red, and a deep, ominous sound echoed from the device. Zara froze. Her glowing markings brightened for a moment, and James saw genuine fear cross her face. She turned to him, speaking rapidly in her language, her tone urgent. James couldn't understand a word, but he knew something was very wrong. "What is it? What's going on?" he asked, his voice rising. He stepped closer, but Zara quickly raised her device, pointing it at him. A soft hum filled the air as the tip of the device began to glow. James froze mid-step, his hand still raised. "Whoa, whoa, whoa, I'm not your enemy," he shouted. "I don't even know what's happening." Zara's eyes narrowed, and for a tense moment, James thought she might actually fire. But then she hesitated, her expression softening just slightly. Slowly, she lowered the device, though she didn't let go of it. "Thank you," James said, exhaling in relief. "Look, I get that you don't trust me, but we're stuck in this together. You can't just—" Before he could finish, a loud thud echoed from outside the room. James turned sharply toward the door. His apartment was small, and the noise had come from the living room. Zara's head snapped toward the sound as well. Her glowing markings flared brighter, and she gripped her device tightly. James's pulse quickened. "What was that?" he whispered, inching toward the door. Zara moved with him, her body tense like a coiled spring. She glanced at him, then pointed to the door and made a motion as if telling him to stay back. "Stay back?" "In my own apartment," James whispered incredulously. But Zara ignored him, creeping closer to the door. Her movements were graceful yet precise, like a trained soldier. James couldn't help but marvel at her. Another thud came, this time followed by a strange clicking sound, like claws tapping against the floor. James's breath caught in his throat. His apartment door had been locked, so whoever, or whatever, was out there had forced its way in. Zara reached the door and pressed her ear against it, her glowing device held at the ready. James followed her, despite her earlier warning. "What's out there?" he whispered. Zara didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted her device, and a holographic display returned, showing what looked like a radar screen. Two bright dots glowed on the display, one for Zara, and another for James. But there was a third dot moving toward them from the living room. "Oh, great," James muttered. "It's not just an intruder, it's a high-tech intruder." Before Zara could react, the door burst open, and a massive figure lunged into the room. It was an alien, but not like Zara. This creature was monstrous, with thick, dark armor covering its body and glowing red eyes that burned with malice. Its sharp claws gleamed in the faint light of the room, and a low, guttural growl rumbled from its throat. James stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his chair. "What the?" Zara didn't hesitate. She raised her device and fired a beam of light directly at the creature. The beam hit its armor, sending sparks flying, but it didn't stop the creature. It roared and charged at her. Zara dodged with incredible speed, rolling to the side and firing again. "Get out of here, James," she shouted suddenly, her voice clear and commanding. James blinked in shock. Did she just speak English? "How do you?" he began, but Zara cut him off. "Go," she yelled, dodging another swipe from the creature. "Hide." James didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled out of the room, his heart pounding as he ran toward the kitchen. He ducked behind the counter, his breathing shallow. From the bedroom, he heard blasts of energy and the creature's guttural roars. The walls shook with the force of their battle. James clutched the edge of the counter, his mind racing. He didn't know what Zara was, why she was here, or what that thing wanted. But one thing was clear. His life was no longer the boring, predictable routine it had been. And as terrifying as this was, a small part of him knew there was no turning back now. Unlikely allies. The sounds of the battle echoed through James's small apartment. Furniture toppled, walls cracked, and the air was filled with alien growls and sharp bursts of energy beams. James crouched behind the kitchen counter, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear himself think. This was supposed to be just another normal night. Now his apartment was ground zero for a fight between beings from another world. He could hear Zara shouting, her words a mix of her alien language and broken English. "No harm. Leave now." Her voice carried authority, but it was clear she was strained. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going down easily. James peeked around the edge of the counter just in time to see Zara dodge another vicious swipe from the armored creature. Despite her elegance, she was clearly outmatched. The creature's movements were brutal and unrelenting, and her energy blasts seemed to do little more than slow it down. James's mind raced. He couldn't just stay hidden while she fought alone. But what could he do? He was just a regular guy. No weapons, no training. Yet, as he looked at the chaos unfolding in his bedroom, something inside him snapped. He couldn't leave her to face this alone. He grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a heavy frying pan from the stove. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Taking a deep breath, he crept toward the doorway, trying not to make a sound. His palms were sweaty, and his legs felt like jelly, but he kept moving. Zara was backed into a corner now, her glowing markings flickering as she struggled to stay on her feet. The creature roared, raising a clawed hand for a final strike. Without thinking, James ran into the room and swung the frying pan as hard as he could. The pan connected with the creature's head, producing a loud metallic clang. The creature stumbled, clearly more annoyed than hurt, and turned its glowing red eyes toward James. He froze, realizing he might have just made things worse. Hi," he said weakly, taking a step back. The creature let out a guttural snarl and lunged at him. James barely had time to duck as a massive claw swiped past his head, tearing through the drywall behind him. He scrambled backward, heart racing. "Bad idea. Bad idea," he yelled. Before the creature could attack again, a brilliant blue beam of light struck its back. The creature roared in pain and turned to face Zyra, who had used the distraction to charge her device for a more powerful shot. This time, the blast knocked the creature off its feet, sending it crashing into the wall. "James," Zyra shouted, panting. "Stay down." "Yeah, no kidding," James replied, crawling behind the bed for cover. His mind was spinning. She spoke English now. How? Did she learn it that fast, or had she been hiding it the whole time? He didn't have time to dwell on it. The creature was already getting back up, its armor sparking where Zyra's blast had hit. Zyra moved quickly, pulling James to his feet and half-dragging him toward the door. "No one here. We run." "Run? Where?" James asked as she shoved him into the hallway. The creature roared behind them, the sound shaking the walls. Zyra didn't answer. She just grabbed his wrist and pulled him along. They burst out into the night. The streets were empty, the usual hum of late-night traffic replaced by an eerie silence. Zyra glanced over her shoulder, her glowing eyes scanning for signs of pursuit. The creature didn't seem to be following, yet. James stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a lamppost. "Okay, time out. What the hell was that thing? And why is it in my apartment?" Zyra hesitated, looking at him with an expression that was both apologetic and urgent. "Hunter," she said simply. Follow me." "Follow you? From where?" James demanded. Zyra gestured vaguely to the sky. "My world. I escape. They chase." James blinked. "You're telling me that thing came here from another planet, and now it's wrecking my life because of you?" Zyra flinched at the accusation, her glowing markings dimming slightly. "No choice," she said quietly. "Portal. Unstable. Accident. Sorry." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. As insane as this all was, he couldn't bring himself to stay angry. She clearly didn't want to be here any more than he wanted to be involved. "Fine. Apology accepted. But what do we do now? That thing's still out there, and I don't think it's just going to give up." Zyra's device beeped, and she looked down at the holographic display. Her expression grew grim. "More come." James's stomach dropped. "More? As in, more of those things?" She nodded. "Hunter signal. Call others. We must go." James groaned. "Great, this just keeps getting better." Zyra started walking, her movements quick and purposeful. "Safe place. Need find," she said. She looked back at him, her glowing eyes softening. "You help." James hesitated. He could have just walked away. This wasn't his fight. But as he looked at her, this alien princess, far from home and hunted by dangerous creatures, he couldn't bring himself to leave her. She needed him, and whether he liked it or not, he was already in too deep to back out. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'll help." Zyra gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." As they moved through the dark streets together, James couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. One thing was certain, his life was never going to be the same. The hunters arrive. The quiet streets of the neighborhood felt unnaturally eerie as James and Zyra moved quickly under the cover of darkness. The faint hum of streetlights buzzed overhead, but the air carried a tense stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. James's mind raced as he tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. An alien princess from another world was standing beside him. And now, they were being hunted by armored creatures straight out of a nightmare. "Where are we even going?" James whispered, keeping his voice low. He glanced around nervously, half expecting one of the hunters to leap out of the shadows. Zara held up her device, the glowing holographic display flickering above it. She pointed at the map it projected, showing a pulsing blue dot nearby. "Safe point," she said in her clipped, accented English. "Temporary, not permanent." James squinted at the display. He couldn't make sense of the alien symbols or the layout of the map, but he trusted that Zara knew what she was doing. "Okay, but we need to hurry. If more of those things are coming, I don't want to be standing around waiting to meet them." Zara nodded, her glowing markings flickering faintly. She looked tired, her movements slower than before. James realized she must have been pushing herself hard since the moment she arrived in his apartment. Whatever power she had, it seemed to come at a cost. The duo rounded a corner, the distant hum of traffic barely audible now. James looked back over his shoulder, his paranoia growing with every step. He didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. "Are they tracking us?" he asked, his voice tense. Zara hesitated before answering. "Hunter device. Scan. It. Follow energy." She gestured to her glowing skin, her voice tinged with frustration. "My mark. Cannot hide." James frowned. "So you're like a walking beacon for them. That's just great." Before Zara could respond, a sharp metallic clang echoed through the air. James froze, his heart skipping a beat. The sound had come from behind them, maybe a block or two away. He turned slowly, straining his ears. The street was empty, but the faint sound of heavy footsteps grew louder, accompanied by a low guttural growl. "They're here," James whispered, his voice barely audible. Zara's glowing markings flared brighter as she gripped her device, her posture tensing. She motioned for James to follow her as she ducked into an alleyway. They moved quickly, weaving between dumpsters and stacks of discarded cardboard. James tried to keep his breathing steady, but the growing sound of footsteps behind them made it impossible. Suddenly, a loud crash shattered the silence. James whipped around just in time to see a hulking figure land at the entrance of the alleyway. It was another hunter, similar to the first, but even more imposing. Its dark armor gleamed under the dim light, and its glowing red eyes locked onto Zara immediately. A deep, rumbling growl escaped its throat as it raised a strange, blade-like weapon that crackled with energy. "Run!" Zara shouted, grabbing James's arm and pulling him further down the alley. They sprinted as fast as they could, the hunter's heavy footsteps pounding behind them. James' lungs burned, and his legs felt like lead, but adrenaline kept him moving. Zara, despite her earlier exhaustion, moved with an almost supernatural grace, leading him through a maze of narrow paths and tight corners. The hunter, however, was relentless. It smashed through obstacles with ease, its growls growing louder as it closed the distance. James glanced back and saw the creature raise its weapon, a burst of energy charging at the tip. "Get down," Zara yelled, shoving James to the ground just as a beam of crackling energy shot past them, narrowly missing his head. The beam struck a nearby wall, exploding in a shower of sparks and debris. James scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding. "This is insane," he shouted. "We can't outrun that thing forever." Zara didn't respond. Instead, she pulled out her device and pressed a series of buttons. The holographic map reappeared, and she pointed toward a nearby structure. "There," she said. "We trap it." "Trap it? Are you serious?" James asked, but there was no time to argue. Zara was already moving, and he had no choice but to follow. The structure turned out to be an abandoned warehouse, its windows broken and its walls covered in graffiti. The inside was dark and cavernous, with rusted machinery and scattered debris littering the floor. Zara moved quickly, scanning the area with her device as she muttered something in her native language. The hunter burst through the entrance moments later, its glowing eyes piercing the darkness. It let out a deafening roar, the sound echoing off the walls. James and Zara ducked behind a large metal beam. their breaths shallow as they tried to stay hidden. Zira pressed another button on her device, and a faint hum filled the air. James watched as small, glowing nodes appeared around the room, projecting a web of shimmering light. "Trap," Zira whispered, her voice steady despite the tension. The hunter stepped forward cautiously, its weapon raised. It seemed to sense the trap, but it couldn't see the nodes themselves. Zira motioned for James to stay put as she crept to the side, her glowing markings dimmed to avoid detection. James held his breath as the hunter moved closer, its heavy footsteps reverberating through the warehouse. Just as it reached the center of the trap, Zira activated her device. The glowing web snapped into place, encasing the hunter in a cage of crackling energy. The creature roared in fury, thrashing against the walls of the trap. The energy crackled and sparked, holding it in place, but not for long. Cracks began to form in the web, and James realized the trap wouldn't hold. "We need to go. Now," Zira said, grabbing his arm. As they fled into the night once again, James couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep running, and how many more hunters were on their trail. One thing was certain, this fight was far from over. The chase, James and Zira, burst out of the abandoned warehouse, their footsteps echoing against the cracked pavement. The cold night air stung James's lungs as he struggled to keep up with Zira's swift, almost effortless movements. Behind them, the hunters' furious roars filled the air, echoing through the empty streets like thunder. The trap had bought them only seconds, and now it was already crumbling under the creature's sheer strength. "Please tell me you have a plan," James yelled, his voice strained as they rounded a corner. Zira glanced back, her glowing markings flickering faintly in the dim light. "Safe zone. Not far," she said, holding up her device. The holographic map reappeared, showing the blinking blue dot they had been heading toward. It wasn't far, but with the hunter so close behind, it felt like miles away. Another deafening roar echoed from the warehouse as the hunter finally broke free. James didn't dare look back, but the sound of its heavy footsteps pounding against the ground made his heart race. "That thing's faster than it looks," he gasped, his legs already burning from exertion. Zira's face was grim. "It not stop. Not until I gone." "Great. No pressure," James muttered under his breath. He had never run this hard in his life, and now he was doing it with the weight of the world, or at least the weight of an alien princess's survival, on his shoulders. As they ran, the streets seemed to close in around them, the tall buildings and dark alleyways creating a maze of shadows. James wasn't even sure where they were anymore. His mind was too clouded with fear and exhaustion to focus on their surroundings. All he could do was follow Zira and hope she knew where she was going. Suddenly, the hunter's growl sounded much closer than before. James risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his stomach drop. The creature had leaped onto the rooftops and was now bounding from building to building, its glowing red eyes fixed on them. It was using the height to its advantage, closing the distance far faster than they could on foot. "Zira," James shouted, pointing upward. "It's on the rooftops." Zira looked up, her expression hardening. "No choice," she said, her voice tight. She stopped abruptly, spinning around to face the hunter. Her glowing device hummed as she aimed it at the creature, the energy building up for a powerful shot. "What are you doing?" James yelled, skidding to a stop beside her. "Stall it," Zira said simply, her tone calm but firm. "You keep running." "Like hell I'm leaving you," James shot back. His heart was pounding, not just from fear, but from a surge of determination. He wasn't going to abandon her, not after everything they'd been through. The hunter leaped from the rooftop, landing in the middle of the street with a ground-shaking thud. Its glowing eyes locked onto Zira, and it let out a deafening roar, raising its crackling energy blade. Without hesitation, Zira fired her device, a blinding blue beam of energy striking the creature square in the chest. The force of the blast sent the hunter stumbling backward, but it didn't fall. Instead, it roared again, more furious than ever, and charged at Zyra with terrifying speed. "Move," James shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her to the side just as the hunter's blade came crashing down. The ground where they had stood cracked and sparked from the impact, sending chunks of pavement flying in every direction. Zyra staggered but quickly regained her footing, her glowing markings flaring brightly as she adjusted her device. She fired again, this time aiming for the hunter's legs. The beam struck its target, causing the creature to falter momentarily. "Go," Zyra yelled, pushing James forward. James hesitated for a split second, his instincts screaming at him to stay and help. But then he remembered the holographic map and the blinking blue dot, the safe zone. If they didn't make it there, this would all be for nothing. Gritting his teeth, he nodded and took off running again. Zyra followed close behind, her device still glowing in her hand. The hunter roared in frustration and gave chase, its massive form barreling through the street like a freight train. James could feel the ground shaking beneath his feet with every step the creature took. Ahead of them, the road opened into a large, overgrown park. The path was uneven, and the tall grass made it hard to see where they were stepping. James stumbled several times, but managed to keep moving, fueled by pure adrenaline. He could hear the hunter crashing through the trees behind them, its growls growing louder with every second. "We're not gonna make it," James shouted, his voice cracking. Zyra's markings flared again, brighter this time, and she grabbed his wrist. "Trust me," she said, pulling him sharply to the right. They veered off the main path and into a dense thicket of trees. The branches scratched at James's face and arms, but he didn't dare slow down. Zyra led the way, her glowing markings lighting up the darkness like a beacon. Finally, they emerged into a clearing. In the center of the open space was a strange metallic structure, half buried in the ground and covered in vines. It didn't look human-made. James realized this must be the safe zone Zyra had been talking about. "What is that?" he asked, panting. "Shelter," Zyra replied, already running toward it. She pressed her device against the structure, and a panel slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the dimly lit interior. Inside. Now, James didn't need to be told twice. He ducked inside the opening, and Zyra followed, slamming the panel shut behind them. The sound of the hunter's roars grew faint as the thick metal walls sealed them in. For a moment, there was only silence. James collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. Zyra leaned against the wall, her glowing markings dimming once again. They were safe. For now. James looked up at her, his chest still heaving. "That was the most insane thing I have ever done." Zyra managed a faint smile. "More to come," James groaned, letting his head fall back against the wall. He wasn't sure how much more of this he could handle, but one thing was clear: the night was far from over. The turning point. Inside the strange metallic shelter, the air felt charged with a faint hum of alien energy. The walls glowed faintly with soft blue patterns, pulsating rhythmically like a heartbeat. James slumped against the curved wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Zyra, standing across from him, looked equally exhausted, her glowing markings flickering weakly as she clutched her device. James broke the silence first, his voice hoarse. "What is this place?" Zyra knelt beside a control panel embedded in the floor, her fingers dancing across the glowing symbols. "Safe zone," she said, her voice calm but laced with weariness. "Old station. From my people." James's brows furrowed. "Wait, you're telling me your people have been here before? On Earth?" Zyra hesitated, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Long ago. We observe. Study." She paused, as if searching for the right words. "But no stay. Too dangerous." "Dangerous?" James asked, sitting up straighter. "For who? You or us?" Zyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured to the walls, where faint images of stars and planets shimmered into view. Earth, unique. Many seek it. Hunters, not first. James felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to ask more, but the pounding ache in his legs and the persistent adrenaline clouding his thoughts made it hard to focus. Great, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. So, Earth's a galactic hotspot for trouble. Fantastic. Zara didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to the control panel, her glowing device syncing with the station's systems. The room hummed louder as the lights brightened, and a large holographic map appeared in the center of the space. It displayed the surrounding area, with several glowing red dots moving in a pattern that made James's stomach sink. "They're still looking for us," he said grimly, pointing to the map. Zara nodded. "Hunters, no stop. They sense me." James looked at her glowing markings, which were dimmer now, but still visible. "Because of those markings, right? Is there any way to hide them?" She shook her head. "Not hide. They, part of me, my energy." "Great," James muttered. "So what's the plan? We just stay here and hope they don't find us." Zara's expression hardened. "No, they find. Always." She pointed to the holographic map, highlighting a larger red dot moving closer to their location. "Leader. Stronger. Smarter." James's stomach tightened. "Stronger than the thing we just ran from. You've got to be kidding me." Zara didn't laugh or smile. She simply looked at him with those glowing, otherworldly eyes, her face set in a mask of determination. "I fight. Stop them." James shot to his feet. "Whoa, whoa, whoa. You can't just go out there alone. That's suicide." "I must," Zara said firmly. "They, no stop until I gone. You, not safe." James clenched his fists. "Yeah, well, I'm not just gonna sit here while you sacrifice yourself. We've made it this far together. We'll figure something out." Zara tilted her head, her expression softening. "Why? You? Help me. Why?" James hesitated, unsure how to answer. He had asked himself the same question more than once since this whole ordeal began. Finally, he shrugged, giving her a small wry smile. "I guess I just have a thing for helping damsels in distress, even if they're from another planet." Zara's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. Strange. Human. "Yeah, well, I get that a lot," James replied. Before Zara could respond, the shelter trembled violently, and a loud metallic screech echoed through the air. The red dots on the holographic map began converging on their location. James's heart sank as he realized the hunters had found them. "They're here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Zara stood, her glowing markings flaring brighter as she gripped her device. "No more run," she said, her tone resolute. "We fight." James looked around the room, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a long, cylindrical object leaning against the wall. It looked like some kind of alien staff, its surface etched with glowing blue patterns. He grabbed it and turned to Zara. "I'm with you." Zara glanced at the staff and nodded. "Activate," she said, motioning for him to press a button near the top. James did as instructed, and the staff crackled to life, emitting a faint blue glow. He swung it experimentally, feeling the strange energy course through his arms. "Okay, this is cool." The shelter trembled again, and the screeching grew louder. The holographic map showed the hunters closing in, their leader's dot now at the entrance. Zara turned to James, her glowing eyes fierce. "Stay close. No, hesitate." James nodded, gripping the staff tightly. "Got it." The entrance burst open, and the leader of the hunters stepped inside. It was larger than the others, its armor more intricate and covered in glowing red symbols. Its eyes burned with intelligence and malice as it scanned the room, locking onto Zara. "You're mine," it growled, its voice deep and guttural. Zara stepped forward, her markings glowing brighter than ever. "No," she said, her voice steady and defiant. "You end here." The hunter roared, charging at her with terrifying speed. Zyra met it head-on, her device firing a brilliant beam of energy that collided with the hunter's blade, creating a blinding explosion of light. James shielded his eyes, then rushed forward, swinging the glowing staff at one of the smaller hunters that had followed their leader inside. The room erupted into chaos as the battle began. For the first time, James wasn't just running or hiding, he was fighting. And though fear coursed through him, so did something else: determination. Together, he and Zyra fought like a team, each protecting the other as they faced the hunters head-on. The odds were against them, but James felt a strange sense of hope. For the first time, he believed they might actually win. The final stand. The air inside the shelter crackled with tension as the battle raged on. The leader of the hunters towered over Zyra, its glowing red eyes locked onto her with a chilling intensity. Sparks flew as their weapons clashed, beams of energy colliding in a dazzling display of light and sound. James, gripping the alien staff, stood at her side, sweat dripping from his brow as he swung wildly at another hunter trying to flank them. The room was chaos. Every surface seemed alive with energy, the walls vibrating under the strain of the battle. James's breaths came in ragged gasps, his arms aching from the relentless effort. Still, he refused to back down. Every time he thought he might give in to the fear, he looked at Zyra. Her glowing markings burned brighter than ever, her movements precise and unyielding. She fought not just with skill, but with a purpose that radiated from her every move. James swung the staff again, the energy at its tip slamming into one of the hunters and sending it sprawling across the room. "One down," he yelled, turning to Zyra. "How are you holding up?" Zyra didn't respond immediately. She was locked in a deadly standoff with the leader, their weapons crackling as they pressed against each other. Her face was set in a mask of determination, but James could see the strain in her glowing markings. She was reaching her limit. The leader snarled, breaking the clash and swiping at her with its massive blade. Zyra dodged, but the movement cost her. She stumbled slightly, and the hunter took advantage, lunging forward. James reacted instinctively, throwing himself between them. The hunter's blade slammed into his staff, the impact sending a shockwave through his arms. "Not today," James shouted, gritting his teeth as he pushed back with all his strength. The hunter growled in frustration, its red eyes narrowing. Behind him, Zyra regained her footing, her markings flaring brightly. "James, move," she yelled. Without hesitation, James ducked and rolled out of the way. Zyra unleashed a powerful blast of energy from her device, striking the hunter square in the chest. The creature roared in pain, its armor cracking under the force of the attack. But it wasn't finished. It staggered, its movements slower but still dangerous. "It's too strong," James shouted, scrambling to his feet. "What's it going to take to stop this thing?" Zyra's eyes flickered with a mix of resolve and sorrow. "Station. Power core. Overload," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. James's stomach dropped. "Overload? You mean blow this whole place up?" Zyra nodded, her gaze unwavering. "No choice. Hunters, stop only if no survive." James stared at her, his mind racing. The idea of destroying the shelter, and themselves along with it, was terrifying. But as he looked at the map on the wall, showing more hunters converging on their location, he realized she was right. If they didn't end this here and now, the hunters wouldn't stop. Not ever. "Fine," he said, swallowing hard. "What do we have to do?" Zyra moved quickly to the central console, her glowing device syncing with the station's systems. The room began to vibrate as the hum of energy grew louder. "Core. Release energy." Big explosion. "Yeah, I figured that part out," James muttered, watching as the holographic map flickered and shifted. "But how do we survive this?" Zyra hesitated, her fingers pausing on the console. "Portal. Open. Before explosion." But she looked at him, Her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "It's unstable," James groaned. "Of course it's unstable. Why wouldn't it be?" The leader of the hunters roared behind them, its armor glowing red-hot as it charged toward the console. James reacted without thinking, swinging his staff with all his might. The energy at the tip connected with the hunter's chest, sending it stumbling backward. "Zyra, whatever you're doing, do it faster." Zyra's fingers flew across the console, the glowing symbols shifting rapidly. "Almost done," she said, her voice tight with focus. The room trembled violently as the station's systems began to overload. Lights flickered, and the air grew heavy with the hum of raw energy. James could feel the heat rising, beads of sweat dripping down his face. He glanced at the holographic map, which now displayed a countdown in alien symbols. He didn't need to understand the language to know their time was running out. "Portal. Now," Zyra shouted, slamming her hand down on the console. A shimmering rift opened in the air, its edges crackling with unstable energy. The swirling blue light was beautiful and terrifying all at once. James felt his heart race as he looked at it. "That's our way out?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Zyra nodded, grabbing his arm. "Go." James hesitated, looking back at the leader of the hunters. It was still standing, its armor cracked, but its determination unshaken. "What about it?" he asked, pointing at the creature. Zyra's glowing markings flared brightly as she stepped forward, placing herself between James and the hunter. "I end it." James's eyes widened. "No, you can't." She turned to him, her expression calm but firm. "You must go. Portal. Close soon." James wanted to argue, to tell her there had to be another way. But the look in her eyes silenced him. She had made her choice. "Zyra," he began, his voice breaking. "Go," she said softly, giving him a small, sad smile. "You, brave, live." Before he could say anything else, Zyra turned and unleashed a final, blinding blast of energy at the hunter. James hesitated for a moment longer, then forced himself to move. He ran toward the portal, the heat and light of the overloading station pressing against his back. As he leaped through the shimmering rift, he felt the world shift around him. The air grew cool, and the sounds of the battle faded. When he landed on the other side, he found himself in a quiet, empty field under a starry sky. The portal behind him closed with a faint snap, leaving him alone. For a long moment, James just lay there, staring up at the stars. His chest ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Zyra was gone, and he had no idea if she had survived. But as he looked at the vast expanse of the night sky, he felt a strange sense of hope. She had given him a chance to live, and he wasn't going to waste it. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice carried away by the wind.